What I'm here to talk with everyone here today about is a world without state borders and the possibility of living in a world without state borders. And so what I want to share with you all to start off with is a history lesson that I first learned from my grandpa when I was 8 years old. And like most of us, this was one of the most important lessons that I learned, and it wasn't in school. And it was the history of partition. And so partition is what you see there. It happened in 1947. And it was a border, a colonially imposed border that essentially created India and Pakistan as we know it. And what happened is in this region here, Punjab and Himachal, which is where my dad's from Himachal, my mom's from Punjab. My grandpa fought against the British Raj in the area of the Punjab, as millions and millions of other people did during the British Empire. What happened was in 1947, a completely new border was imposed on people. So millions of people who had lived in relative harmony in villages with people of different religions and different cultural and ethnic backgrounds were suddenly forced to make the decision of which entirely new country they were going to pledge allegiance to. So what that meant is that millions of people, literally, the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, estimates that it is the single largest mass displacement in human history. 14 million people migrated, had to move. So 14 million people had to make the decision, an incredibly tough decision, to move themselves, their children, and leave their homes, leave their crops, leave their villages, leave everything familiar and intimate to them and their lives, and move to an entirely new place. And again, an entirely new country that actually didn't even exist prior to that. Approximately 500,000 people died making that trek. 500,000 people. Because of natural causes, starvation, malnutrition, not being adequately equipped to make the trek, and also because of communal violence. Right? Communal violence that flared because of these totally constructed new identities as a result of the nationalism of what India and Pakistan became. And now, decades later, we see very similar stories emerging every single day on our news feeds, on social media, on TV. We see millions and millions of migrants, an unprecedented number. The UN estimates 60 million people today are displaced people fleeing, searching for safety. And we see images like this of young children being forced through barbed wires by their parents in the hopes that if the parents can't go, at least their children will make it through these borders in the hopes of a new life. We see images of fortress borders, of police batons, of tear gas. We see images of parents with their children being torn away from their outstretched arms as they're separated by border guards. We see, and by other government authorities. We also see really jarring images of bodies on beaches, of drowned bodies, of people suffocating in containers and in the backs of vehicles, right? This is happening every single day. And so one thing that has struck me, and perhaps it has struck you as well, is that in every single one of these interviews, every single person says almost the exact same thing. We just want to live. Why are there borders? We just want to live. Why are there borders? And for some of us, that may seem like a rhetorical question. But if we think about it from the perspective of those who are asking the question, it is a very urgent question when you are fleeing safety and you are faced with this, and your child is faced with this. And I want to offer up and take up that question, why borders? Because I think it is really one of the most profound moral questions of our time. 60 million people are displaced on this planet, and this is what they're facing. Most of them. This is what they're facing. So what I want to offer to you today, suggest to you, my contention to you today, is that we don't actually need borders. And my contention is that borders actually create more violence, and that eliminating borders would actually stop a lot of the violence. And so I know you all are probably thinking, she's crazy. We can't really have this. You're crazy. It's coming up. You must be thinking, right, yeah, what is she talking about, right? That this is a talk on cognitive dissonance, but this is like, this woman's like dissonance on speed, right? But really, we need to understand that borders are very, very new in human history. So even for me, I understand that what I'm saying probably sounds absurd, because before I understood from my grandfather about the history of partition, I thought India was always India and Pakistan was always Pakistan, despite the fact that in the context of South Asia, partition is actually only a few decades old. Yet I had normalized the idea that that border was man-made, or was as if it was a part of natural law, as if it was part of the natural world, when in fact it was created by humans, by men mostly, just a few decades ago. And if we look back to here, Turtle Island, where we're all on today, Canada imposed itself on these lands only 150 years ago, right? 150 years is a long time, but in the span of time immemorial, that is nothing. Sorry? 408? Oh, yes, thank you. Yes. Canada confederated 150 years ago. Yes, thank you. In terms of confederation, 150 years ago. And so when we look back to the ways in which communities have lived, right, we see that border, even in the context of Canada and the US, is one that has divided communities, right? It has divided communities across borders, and communities lived in other affinity groups much prior to that. And that is true of almost every single state border on this planet today. And especially if we look at the system of border controls, right, of militarized borders, of fences, of walls to keep people out, this is a very, very new system when it comes to the entire history of human history. So you might be like, no, we need borders. The people coming here aren't like us. They'll drain our resources. What if they're terrorists? It's not our problem, right? Those are some of the most common things that we hear when people talk about why we might need borders. So I want to take some of these up. So the idea of they aren't like us, this is something we've been hearing in certain ways in the past few weeks. We've heard Prime Minister Stephen Harper talk about old stock Canadians not being like new stock Canadians. And, we wonder what that means, right? When he's talking about old stock Canadians, is he talking about Indigenous people, First Nations people, people who've been here since time immemorial? Is he talking about Chinese Canadian communities that have been here for over a century? For myself, I asked myself, I'm like, what stock am I? Am I old stock? Am I new stock? Maybe some of you guys were asking yourself that too, right? We had to really ask ourselves what kind of stock we are. And, social media really took this up. People really challenged these kinds of comments, and I want to say it's not unique to him, right? He just framed it in a particular way, but this idea of us and them, and the idea that we are supposed to be a certain way. What is an old stock Canadian, right? What is an old stock Canadian? And people have pointed out that his comments really were code for white Canadian. That's who he was talking about. When he's talking about old stock Canadian, he's talking about white Canadians, and new stock Canadians are people who are non-white. And interestingly, you all might be interested in knowing, so BC, the province that I'm living in right now, there's actually just as many new stock Canadians who are European than those who are not, right? But I guarantee you that's not who he's thinking about, or most people are thinking about, when people are thinking about immigrants. When people think about immigrants and the idea that they're not like us, we're mostly talking about people of color, people who are not white. And we see this in polls like one that was conducted a few months ago, where ECOS researched asked more than 2,000 Canadians of the immigrants who come to Canada are too few, too many, or the right amount visible minorities. 41% said too many are visible minorities, right? So the conflation between immigration and race relations is clear. We're talking about not wanting predominantly people of color to arrive as immigrants, and when people like Harper are talking about old stock Canadian, this is racially coded language. It's creating hierarchies of who we think belong and who we think don't belong. I want to offer a quote from writer Teju Cole, who's a brilliant writer in the States. And so he was writing in that context, but he was saying, I don't believe that radical inclusivity is going to destroy our way of life when I generally don't know what you're talking about, or what hour you're talking about, and when I think we can do much better than this malevolent way of living anyway. Did all 16 of your great-grandparents live, work, and die in the same town where you now live? If no, then you're a child of migrants. If yes, then y'all seriously need to get out more. So this is his light-hearted way of responding to some anti-immigrant sentiment.
The second is the idea of immigrants will drain our resources. So in response to that, I want to really suggest, who is subsidizing whom? What's the stereotype or the assumption there? So if we look at this is just a few of them, I can offer a lot more. But immigrants are underpaid to the tune of $12.6 billion. So the active deskilling and lack of accreditation of migrants and refugees means that $12.6 billion is going into the pockets of the Canadian economy. Furthermore, farm workers, for example, migrant farm workers who come to Canada to work as temporary foreign workers have collectively contributed an estimated $3.4 million into EI premiums, but are not actually able to claim them. So when we go on EI, part of that subsidy is provided by workers who work in Canada, who live in Canada, who pay into EI, but have absolutely no access to them, right? So we really need to question who is subsidizing whom. Thank you. This is, just a really quick slide. There's a lot more. I don't want to go into all of the details, but also when we have this idea of scarcity, right, that we don't have enough pensions, we don't have enough universal health care, that we can't feasibly pay for everybody, it's really a question of political priority. So there's been studies done, this is from the Unite Against Austerity campaign, that shows actually if we just implemented really basic progressive tax schemes in Canada, then we could actually generate $31.1 billion to fund public services. And these are simple things like a financial transaction tax, an inheritance tax, and oil subsidies in the range of $1 billion, right? So this is an issue of political priority. Next, they're all terrorists. So you may not know this if you listen to the media a whole lot, but you're actually, this is statistically true, you are much more likely to be killed in Canada by a moose than by a terror plot. And this is true. But also, those kinds of jokes aside, CSIS itself, Canada's spy agency, has highlighted that the white supremacist threat in Canada of organized white supremacist groups is actually ahead of radical Islam, right? But we wouldn't know that if we listened to the news, because all we hear in the news in the context of Canada is, right, ISIS, ISIL, Al-Qaeda, etc. And when we talk about terrorism in these ways, in these really loaded ways, these kind of buzzwords to shut down conversation, it means that we prioritize things like fairly non-existent terror plots to Canada and don't prioritize real violence that is happening, right? Like missing and murdered Indigenous women. And terrorism has become that kind of buzzword where we all believe we are prone to some kind of attack, regardless of the actual factual accuracy of that being a reality. And I have to confess, as a new mom, I'm already thinking of how amazing it will be to use the terror word, being like, Mom, can I go to the mall? No, the terrorists might get you. Can I have a sleepover? No, the terrorists might get you. Okay. It's like that kind of word, right? There's no response. Terrorism, okay. So, the last kind of response is, well, it's not our problem. Fine, all of these things are great. There's no terrorism. They're not actually draining our resources. And fine, they're like us. We're supposed to be multicultural. Fine, I accept all of that. But why is it my problem? And what I want to offer is that, well, actually, it is our problem because part of what has happened is that borders are actually being violated by us, by Canada, all the time. We're not actually respecting borders. So what I want to suggest to all of us to think about is, if the terror threat is blown out of proportion, then what really is the purpose of these borders, right? Are they really here to protect us? And I'd say no, borders actually don't protect us as people. What they are here to do and to further the interests of is the interests of power. So power like empire, right? So we see, this is an old map, but continues in different ways. But this is the growth of the British Empire over time. So you have different colonies of the British. And so you can see clearly how borders were violated in order to spread British Empire, right? The borders of nations in the global south were not recognized or honored. We have, in Canada, 75% of the world's mining operations are Canadian, going into places all around the world, violating human rights, violating environmental standards, going in against the local autonomy of communities all across this planet, and borders are being violated in order to further Canadian mining interests, right? So we don't really, not we as in people, but we in terms of our government and our companies are not respecting borders of different communities, including local communities, right? Industry, we know, is violating free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous nations. This is the Unistoten camp who have, as a result of the violation of their sovereignty, have set up a camp to block 7 different pipelines. 7 different pipelines that are scheduled to go through their community. And so, can we actually live in a world without borders? So, imagine a world where Santa had to deal with Border Patrol. That would be a rough world, right? Imagine telling your kids, like, sorry, Santa can't roll through. He's like held up at customs, right? So these things would be rough on kids. But so, those jokes aside, I understand that what I'm offering, the idea of a world without borders, is a bold proposal, right? It's one that we haven't quite imagined, especially in recent memory, although again, a reminder that it is itself quite new, even though to us it seems like it's always been the way. But one thing that we do know, even if we don't quite know what a world without borders would look like in our context, in this day and age, what we do know is that the amount of violence that is created because borders are hindering people from moving to safety is immense. That violence is immense, and it has to be stopped. What is more cruel? A world with more open borders, or the fact that there are toddlers like Alan Kurdi and his brother and his mother who were drowned, right? Who were found drowned on the Turkish seas and in the Turkish border because their families are being forced to put children into plastic boats in order to seek safety, right? What is more violent and insane? A world with more open borders, or this amount of deaths? These are just the amount of recorded deaths in 9 months last year, totaling almost 5,000 people. 5,000 people. And I wonder, what is more harmful, right? A world with more open borders and a generosity of spirit, or this? This is an image from 2010 when 492 Tamil refugees landed on the west coast of British Columbia, and all 492 people were put into prisons. They were not charged with anything. The government and media decided that they were all terrorists. That was the hype in the media. You might remember that, right? And children. This is a photo that we took outside of the prison of kids. You can see how young they are, who were incarcerated for the crime of migrating to seek a better life. And this is what they faced when they came to Canada, right? So what is more violent and insane? Is it a world with more open borders, or is it this? I would argue that this is far more insane. This is far more harmful. This is far more punitive. This is far more cruel. And so I think there are other possibilities. This is what the border looks like between Netherlands and Belgium. Right? Check that border out. Right? And like play hopscotch on that border. And so, I think it's important. This image reminds us of our interconnectedness. It reminds us of the arbitrariness of putting up borders, especially when those borders affirm global systems of power. Borders are not arbitrary, right? Borders, the way they exist right now, are there to basically affirm the privilege of citizenship that people have by being born in a Western country. That is ultimately the privilege that that border affirms. So if we really want a world that is just, if we really want to dismantle power and we want some level of global equality, if we're talking about global equality, then what denies us the right as people who are able to live with a level of safety in the context of the global north to people seeking that same level of safety in the global south? Especially after decades and decades and centuries of deliberate violence being committed on people in the global south. And, I think this is doable. I think this is doable because every single day there are people, tens of thousands of people who are migrating in the search for safety. There are tens of thousands of people who are defying fortress borders. There are tens and thousands of people who are putting their kids onto dingy boats and still risking their lives, because that is the resilience and the bravery and the commitment to abundance and dignity that migrants have. And I want to end with the words of Eduardo Galeano. Eduardo Galeano is, of course, the late, great poet and writer who told us that we live in a world that is upside down. And we do. We live in a world that is upside down. And one of the things he said that I think we can absolutely strive for and that we can live by is that the world was born yearning to be a home for everyone. Yes. The world was born yearning to be a home for everyone. So thank you.